Snow came down sideways on the county road, thick and mean, the kind that erased tire tracks and swallowed sound. And the boy kept walking anyway, boots 2 sizes too big, socks wet through, breath cutting his chest like broken glass, his fingers wrapped around a folded piece of paper he'd already memorized but refused to lose, because the man who wrote it had said, "Don't trust your head when you're cold, trust your hands." And the boy trusted his hands even as they went numb, because 12. Miles ago, he'd watched his aunt get dragged into the back of a cruiser by men who didn't wear name tags and didn't explain anything. And he'd watched neighbors shut doors and turn faces away. And he'd seen a black SUV idle by the quarry fence like it owned the night. And he'd heard a voice say Hale's handling it. And Hale was a name that made grown men go quiet. And when the boy reached the iron gate with the winged skull welded to it, and the word angels scarred into steel, the dogs barked and the floodlights snapped on, and a dozen shapes moved with practiced calm. Hands near belts, eyes hard, and the boy didn't cry or beg. He just said, "I have a message for Brick," and Brick was inside, sitting at a scarred oak table, coffee gone cold, looking at the map he'd been staring at for an hour because his gut wouldn't settle, because winter nights always pulled old ghosts up by the throat, because promises had a way of coming due when the roads froze, and Brick heard the shout over the radio and felt something in his chest shift like a clutch catching. And when they brought the kid in, shaking, lips blue, hair crusted with snow, Brick didn't ask his name either. None of them did. Not then, because the message mattered more, because the world outside was already pushing, because the paper said Cal's widow is gone, and the county wants the land, and Hale took her, because it said they're coming for the boy next. And Brick closed his eyes and saw a different winter, a different door. Kicked in, a different woman screaming while Badges watched. And when he opened them, he was already standing, chair scraping back, voice low and steady like a road at night. And he told Doc to get the kid warm, told Rafe to lock the gate, told Lobo to wake the floor, and the clubhouse moved like a body that knew its own bones. Because Brick had built it that way after he'd buried too many brothers and learned that loyalty wasn't loud speeches but small orders given once, and the boy sat by the heater, boots steaming, staring at the floor because adults always asked questions he couldn't answer. And Brick crouched in front of him and didn't touch him and didn't smile and didn't promise anything he couldn't keep. He just said, "You did good." And the boy nodded and said, "I walked all night." And Brick said, "I know." And for a moment the room went quiet enough to hear the wind claw the walls. And Brick felt the weight of his cuts on his shoulders. The years of it, the scar under his jaw from A. Bottle, the ache in his hands that never left. And he knew this was the trigger, the thing that forced a line to be drawn, because Hale wasn't a rumor. Hale was a deputy with friends and favors and a grin that meant you were already late. Hale was the kind of man who hid behind procedure and called it law. And Brick had spent a lifetime avoiding men like that until they came to his door anyway. And outside the bikes idled in the snow, engines ticking, black shapes under white, ready, and Brick took the paper and folded it once and put it in his pocket like a vow. And he told the room, "We're not starting a war, we're finishing a promise." And someone laughed because that was Brick, always turning a fight into a duty. And Doc cleared his throat and said, "Kid hasn't slept in 2 days, keeps asking if she's alive." And Brick felt his jaw set and said, "She will be." And nobody argued, because when Brick said a thing like that, it wasn't hope. It was intent, and he stood and looked at the faces. He trusted more than blood. Men and women who'd bled together and patched each other up and buried their dead with their own hands. And he knew once he moved, there was no moving back. And he was fine with that, because the snow had a way of cleaning things, and he nodded to the door, and the night swallowed sound again as engines rose. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And the story kept going anyway, because real nights don't pause for anything. In Brick Road Point, visor down, eyes scanning the empty highway, thinking about Cal's widow and the boy with no name and the way authority rots when it goes unchallenged, thinking about the last time he'd chosen not to act and how that had ended in a coffin with no music. And he remembered a promise he'd made to himself in a hospital hallway years back, that if the world ever put a child in front of him with fear in his eyes and nowhere else to go, he'd stop running from the consequences and start choosing them. And the bikes cut through the dark like knives, and somewhere ahead a deputy named Hale slept easy, believing winter was on his side, believing nobody would come, and Brick smiled behind the visor, not because he enjoyed what was coming, but because he understood it, because family was a line you held even when it burned your hands. And tonight the line had been drawn in snow by a boy who walked 12 miles and never once asked for his name to matter. The clubhouse smelled like oil, wet leather, and old coffee as the doors shut and the snow noise died. And Brick stood at the head of the table while the room filled in around him, jackets hanging, helmets thumping down, faces cut from years of miles and mistakes. And the boy slept on a bench near the heater with Doc keeping watch. Doc's hand steady as he checked fingers and toes and murmured to himself like a prayer he'd learned the hard way. And Rafe leaned by the window, eyes sharp. They look out even indoors, counting headlights on the county road, while Lobo cracked his knuckles and paced because he was the enforcer and still believed movement kept the dark away. And Mays pulled a chair back and spread the map flat, strategist to the bone, pencil already marking lines like he was solving a problem that could kill friends if he got it wrong. And Brick let them settle, because silence was part of his leadership, because men talked truer when you didn't rush them. And someone said, "Hale's a badge, Brick." And Brick nodded like he'd expected that sentence, because Hale was more than a badge. He was a hinge between money and fear. And May said county wants the quarry land bad. Zoning meetings, shell buyers, pressure on Cal's widow till she broke. And when she didn't, they used Hale because Hale knew how to make things look legal after the fact, and Lobo snorted and said legal's a coat you hang on a hook after you beat someone. And Brick said easy, not because he disagreed, but because anger burned fuel they'd need later. And he asked Rafe what the road looked like, and Rafe said quiet but wrong. Too quiet, like someone told folks to stay home. And Brick felt that itch again, the old sense that the board was already set by someone else. And he didn't like playing catch-up. And Doc looked up and said the kid's dehydrated. Frost nipped, but he'll keep his fingers, and Brick nodded and said good. And Doc added he keeps asking if he did it right. And Brick swallowed and said he did. And Mays tapped the map and said Hale won't keep her long. Either she signs or she disappears in a paperwork and nobody ever finds a file. And Brick said where. And Mays circled two places, the old substation by the river and the county impound south of town, both off books after midnight, both guarded by men who knew Hale's smile. And Lobo said we roll. We take both. And Brick shook his head because this wasn't a bar fight. Because badges brought cameras and cameras brought stories, and stories burned clubs down. And Brick said we don't break the law loud. We bend it quiet. And May smiled thin because that was his language. And Brick told him play it like a chess endgame. Minimal moves, maximum leverage. And May said leverage means pressure on Hale's friends, the judge who hunts elk with him, the contractor who pays him cash, the cousin who runs the tow yard. And Brick felt the room lean in because names made things real. And he said, we don't hurt families. And Lobo rolled his eyes, but nodded because rules mattered. And Brick said, we show Hale he's alone. And someone asked, what about the widow? And Brick said, we get her back first because promises had order. And Doc cleared his throat and said, if this goes hot, people bleed. And Brick said, I know. And Doc said, I'll set up triage because Doc always prepared for the worst and pretended it was routine. And Rafe said headlights too, slow, counting plates, and the room went still, hands near belts, breath shallow, and Brick lifted a finger, and the tension eased just enough to think, and the cars passed without stopping. And Brick said, "That's a probe." And Mays said, "Hale's counting responses." And Brick said, "Then we don't give him one yet." And he sent Lobo and two others to shadow the impound from a distance. No contact, just eyes. And he told Rafe to keep the road dark, and Mays to start the calls, quiet ones, favors owed, truths whispered. And Brick went to the bench and looked at the boy, sleeping, the heater ticking, the snow melting off his cuffs. And he thought about how kids learned early what adults were made of. And he promised himself again not to be the wrong lesson. And when he turned back, the room was already moving, because the club was a machine built on trust, because each member knew their role and didn't need applause. And Maze's pencil scratched, and phones buzzed, and Doc laid out gauze and saline like a ritual. And Brick sat and closed his eyes for a count of 10, letting memories wash through without drowning him. The hospital hallway, the badge that wouldn't meet his eyes, the sound of a door closing, and he opened them and felt steady again. And Mays said, "Judges out of town, contractors nervous, cousin at the tow yard drinks and talks." And Brick said, "Good." And Lobo radioed from the dark and said, "Impounds lit up, more cars than usual." And Brick felt the clock speed up, and he said, "Pull back. Don't spook them." And someone asked, "What if Hale moves her tonight?" And Brick said, "Then we follow," because patience was a weapon too. And the boy stirred and whispered her name, and Doc shushed him gentle. And Brick's jaw tightened, because innocence always paid first. And May said, "There's another angle. Brick." And Brick looked up, and May said, "Hale's pride. He likes to be seen as the fix, the man you call. So if we make him choose between saving face and keeping her hidden, he'll choose wrong." And Brick smiled, because May saw the same patterns he did. And Brick said, "Set the bait." And May said, "A zoning appeal filed at dawn. Public forces Hale in a daylight." And Brick said, "Do it." And Rafe said, "More headlights, faster." And Brick stood and said, "This is the line, brothers." And the room answered without words, because loyalty wasn't a speech. It was a posture, and outside engines coughed to life. And Brick felt the pull toward motion, toward the point where plans met blood. And he knew Hale would feel it too. That tightening in the chest when the game stopped being abstract. And as the night pressed closer and radios crackled with updates, Brick understood there was no clean way through what was coming, only a right way and a wrong way. And he'd already chosen, and the chapter of waiting closed with a sense that the next move would not belong to them alone. That somewhere a man with a badge was smiling and sharpening his excuses, and the road between them was narrowing fast. Night broke open just before dawn when Hale made his move, not with sirens or warrants, but with silence, the kind that slid under doors and rearranged lives without asking. And Brick felt it before the radio crackled, a pressure behind the eyes that came from years of knowing how bad men prefer to work. And Maze's phone buzzed with a text that said impounds dark and empty, which meant they'd already moved her, which meant Hale had smelled the plan and chosen to flip the board. And Brick didn't swear or slam the table. He just said, "Mount up," because when the enemy changed tempo, you matched it or died behind the beat. And the bikes rolled in low light through empty highways where frost glittered like broken glass, and the world felt held in a breath. And Brick rode point again, mind cutting through options, thinking about Hale's pride and Hale's friends, and where a man like that hit a woman, he needed quiet. And Mays came up on the comms and said, "Substation's hot, generators humming, 2 unmarked SUVs." And Brick said, "Eyes only." And then Rafe's voice cut in thin and tight and said, "Courthouse lights just came on," which made no sense at that hour unless someone wanted paper to cover tracks. And Brick understood then that Hale wasn't running from daylight. He was using it, planning to move her through the front door with enough ink to drown a scream. And Brick felt the old anger rise and pushed it down because rage made noise and noise killed plans. And he told Mays to split the chessboard, half to the courthouse, half to the river, because Hale liked redundancy and Brick liked cutting both strings at once. And Lobo growled something about finally stretching his legs. And Brick told him, keep them under you, because tonight was about hands, not fists. And as they moved, Doc's calm voice came through, reminding everyone where the kit was, reminding them that blood didn't care who started it. And Brick thought about the boy asleep back at the clubhouse and how he'd wake up and ask again if he'd done it right. And Brick needed to be able to answer yes with a straight face. And when they reached the courthouse parking structure, it was quiet enough to hear the wind. And Brick saw Hale's trick laid out clean. A judge's clerk opening a side door, a tow yard cousin wheeling a file cart, a deputy with no badge number watching the ramp, and Brick smiled behind the visor because Hale had gathered all his sins in one place. And Mays whispered names and roles, and Brick nodded, and the move went smooth until it didn't, because betrayal never announced itself. It just stepped sideways, and the deputy with no badge number turned his head and raised a phone and said they're here, and Brick recognized the voice, not the face, because it belonged to Cole, a prospect they'd washed out years back for skimming, a man Brick had given a chance and a warning and then a door. And now Cole was wearing county gray and selling silence for cash, and Brick felt something tear loose in his chest that wasn't rage but grief, because betrayal always hurt like a memory going bad. And Lobo started forward, and Brick said no, sharp as a cut, because killing Cole here would light the fuse Hale wanted. And instead, Brick stepped out of shadow and spoke like it was a bar and not a trap, saying, Cole, you look tired. And Cole flinched because shame still worked when you let it. And the clerk froze, and the cart rattled, and the judge's door opened, and Hale stepped into the fluorescent light, smiling like he'd been waiting for applause, coat crisp, eyes bright, the kind of man who believed he'd already won because the rules bent for him. And Hale said, Brick, always dramatic, and Brick said, where is she? And Hale laughed soft and said she signed, which was a lie Hale told well, because it was almost true. And Brick felt the room tilt and thought about the widow's hand shaking over a pen and the boy's feet bleeding in snow. And he said, you don't get to keep what you steal just because you write it down. And Hale's smile thinned, and he nodded to the deputy, and the deputy raised a gun, and time stretched into pieces. And Brick made the shocking decision then, the one that would cost him later. And he stepped forward and put his hands up and said, I'll go with you, because Hale's pride couldn't resist a scalp, and because Brick knew if he went quiet, the others could move. And Lobo swore, and Mays hissed Brick no. And Brick said, trust me, because leadership sometimes meant walking into a cage so the door could be locked from outside. And Hale's eyes shone, and he said, see, you understand. And they cuffed Brick and walked him past the cart and into the elevator that smelled like bleach and fear. And Brick counted floors and breaths and watched Hale in the reflection, thinking about leverage and how Hale would overplay it. And when the elevator opened to the basement, Brick heard the generator hum and a woman crying behind a wall. And Hale said, there she is, your cause. And Brick said, let her go. And Hale said, sign the appeal away, and I might. And Brick said, I can't. And Hale said, then watch. And Hale raised a hand, and Brick lunged, knowing he couldn't stop a bullet, but could change where it went. And the shot cracked, and Brick felt fire tear through his shoulder, and he went down hard, and Hale cursed because blood complicated paperwork. And upstairs the plan snapped tight, because Mays had counted on Hale's need to witness his own victory, because Lobo and Rafe cut power at the right second, and the building fell into emergency red. And Doc's voice came steady on the comms, telling them where Brick was bleeding and how to keep him alive. And the widow was pulled from behind the wall, shaking and alive, and saying, my nephew, my nephew. And May said, "We've got her." And Lobo said, "Cole's running." And Brick lay on cold concrete thinking about whether sacrifice felt like this, like choosing pain because it made sense, and Hale. "No, and hissed, you think this ends well." And Brick smiled through blood and said, "It ends honest." And sirens rose outside, not because Hale called them, but because Mays had lit up the judge's name in daylight like he promised. And the basement filled with footsteps that weren't Hale's, and Hale's face changed, the smile finally breaking. And Brick closed his eyes, his hands pressed on his shoulder, and Doc swore softly and told him to breathe. And Brick did, because the collision had happened, and nothing would be the same after, because truths had been dragged into the light and betrayal named itself, and a line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. And as Brick was carried out past the file cart and the frozen clerk and the red lights washing the walls, he thought about the boy again and hoped the lesson would be that walking 12 miles mattered, that sometimes the right thing was heavy and cold and hurt like hell, but it moved the world anyway. Morning came thin and gray, the kind that made even victory feel tired, and Brick woke in a hospital room with machines humming like distant engines and Doc sitting in a chair pretending he wasn't watching every number. And Brick tried to move, and pain told him exactly where he was and what it had cost. And Doc said, "Easy, boss, bullet pass clean, but clean still hurts." And Brick nodded because pain was honest and he trusted honest things. And outside the room, he could hear voices, low and tense. The club holding itself together with coffee and quiet jokes that didn't quite land. And Brick closed his eyes and saw Hale's face when the sirens came, saw the way certainty drained out a man who'd believed paper could save him. And Doc said the widow's safe, statement taken, judge recused, and Brick let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding, because justice was rarely neat, but sometimes it showed up wearing the right shoes. And when Brick was wheeled out, the hallway opened, like a corridor of consequence, because there were reporters and lawyers and a captain with a jaw set hard. And Brick said nothing because silence was a tool too. And at the clubhouse later, the mood was different, quieter, heavier, the kind that came after funerals and births and nights you survive by inches. And Mays laid out the aftermath plain. Hale, suspended pending charges. Cole arrested for obstruction. The contractor flipping. The zoning appeal back on the docket with daylight on it. And Brick listened and nodded and asked about costs, because leaders counted costs even when they hurt. And Lobo said 2 bikes impounded. One brother bruised pride worse than ribs, and Doc said Brick needed rest whether he liked it or not. And Brick said later, because later was where pain waited politely. And then the widow stepped forward, eyes red but steady, and thanked them without making it smaller than it was. And Brick told her she owed them nothing, because debts poisoned gratitude. And she asked about the boy, and Brick said he's here, and the boy stepped out from behind a chair, hair combed, hands clean, eyes still carrying winter, and Brick knelt slowly because humility mattered more than strength in moments like this. And he said, "You did right," again, and the boy nodded and said, "Is she safe?" And Brick said, "She is," and the boy said, "Then okay," like that settled something deep, and Brick felt the room soften, because hardened people needed reminders why they hardened in the first place. And later, when the crowd thinned and night came back like a familiar coat, Brick sat at the table and felt the weight of command settle again, heavier now because it had been tested. And Mays said, "There's fallout." Brick. And Brick said, "There always is." And Mays said, "Rival crews will sniff blood." And Brick said, "Let them, we don't bleed easy." And Rafe said, "Road's quiet, but not asleep." And Brick smiled because the road never slept. It just waited, and Doc cleared his throat and said, "We need to talk about you taking a bullet." And Brick said, "Leadership isn't safe." And Doc said, "Leadership doesn't have to be stupid." And Brick laughed once soft because Doc earned that. And Lobo said, "Hale's people are mad, not just scared." And Brick said, "Good." Anger makes mistakes, and the boy sat nearby drawing bikes on scrap paper. And Brick watched him and thought about how names mattered and didn't, about how stories remembered acts more than labels. And when the fire burned low, Brick told the club the truth, that he'd chosen to walk into a cage and it might not always work, and that next time the cost might be higher, and nobody argued because brotherhood meant sharing risk, not denying it. And one by one, they nodded and stood and clapped shoulders and checked locks because routine was how you stitch yourself back together. And later, Brick went outside alone and looked at the snow melting into mud, tracks blurring, evidence of passage fading like it always did. And he thought about redemption not as a clean slate, but as a ledger you kept balancing with effort. And he thought about Hale sitting somewhere under bright lights telling himself stories, and he felt no joy in that, only a quiet sense of alignment like a bike tuned right after a long ride. And when dawn came again, Brick was at the gate when the widow's car rolled out, waving once. And the boy climbed in beside her and looked back. And Brick lifted a hand, and the boy smiled. And Brick knew then they would never ask his name. Not because it didn't matter, but because some things were bigger than names, because the message had been enough. And as engines turned over and the club prepared to ride, Brick felt the ache in his shoulder and welcomed it as a reminder. Because consequences mattered, because justice carried weight, because family was chosen every day by action. And as they rode out into the thinning snow with the road opening ahead, Brick thought about the next winter and the one after that, and he understood the story wouldn't end clean or easy, but it would end honest, and that was enough to keep the wheels turning.